Okay, everyone, this is my attempt to try and do a video lecture for you for these slides for each thing, each chapter. And so this is my experiment with chapter 20. I know that we've done about half of chapter 20 already in class, and so the first few slides we're just going to go over really quickly. And then we're going to do the second half of it so that you can watch this on your own time. And if this works really well for us, then we will use it as a normal tool. So we'll see how it works out, okay? Okay, so we already talked about kind of the introduction of party politics. There was extremely high voter turnout in the late 19th century, and a lot of that was because politics played out like a soap opera. There was lots of mudslinging and character assassination and voter fraud and various things like that that caused problems. And so you have a number of races being won where the margins are extremely slim. And you have a lot of people who are really interested, I think probably more for the entertainment value than anything else. Different parties had different regional strengths, so you could usually tell by where you lived what parties you would probably ascribe to. For instance, Democrats are very powerful in the South and then southern border states. They were also very powerful where there was a large immigrant population. The Republicans, on the other hand, were very powerful in small town rural areas in New England and the Midwest. And they also drew a lot of support from Civil War veterans, Union Civil War veterans. Also in this period, you have the introduction of a new type of politician, these political machines which are operating in large urban centers. And at the center of those machines are the ward bosses who controlled the machines, and through their control of those machines controlled politics within that particular city. They were manipulative, usually unscrupulous as far as their dealings. And with individuals, though, within the individual community, they often acted as sort of welfare agents. They handed out supplies. They helped immigrants become more accustomed to the United States, and it was all an effort to sort of buy loyalty from these people so that they would vote as they were told to vote after that. Okay, so we also talked about that politics was dominated by a few issues, and two of the major issues were the money supply, how much money was in circulation at any given time, and civil service reform, the spoils system. So as far as the money supply was concerned, the main question that was asked was how much money should be in circulation, and a huge part of that was whether the Civil War greenbacks should continue to be issued. Bankers and creditors believed in a contracted money supply, so getting rid of the greenbacks. People who owed debts, who were usually farmers, business owners, or small business owners, were in favor of an expanded money supply, so keeping the greenbacks. As part of this, you have the foundation of the Greenback Party in 1877, which advocated for an expanded money supply, as well as other benefit measures for workers and farmers and people like that. As prosperity began to return, though, the Greenback Party and its influence began to fade as well, and ultimately the issue revolves around silver, around gold and silver. So silver was used as money, and then they demonetized it in 1873, and it becomes a huge point of contention in the 1896 election later. As far as civil service reform is concerned, there was a movement to try and do away with the old spoils system, which had been in place for quite some time. Those who supported the spoils system claimed that it was a democratic means of filling government positions. Critics said that it was corrupt and it needed to be gotten away with, or done away with. It was mainly upper class reformers who started to push for a merit-based civil service. So these jobs being handed out based on how well a person could actually do the job, as opposed to political support, which was the main way of getting it done at the time. President Hayes, who was elected in 1877, paid some lip service to the idea of civil service reform, and he launched an investigation in New York against the customs office, which resulted in the dismissal of 2 high officials, one of them being Chester Arthur, who was nominated as a vice presidential candidate with Garfield, in a way, or in an attempt to appease the New York voters, essentially, or at least the New York machine. Unfortunately for everyone who was vying or hoping for civil service reform, when Garfield was assassinated, Arthur now becomes the president, and so it sort of gives them a push to really push for that reform. And so that's when we see the passage of the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which sets aside certain jobs for merit-based filling, essentially. Okay, so Arthur is ousted in 1884. He is not renominated as the Republican candidate, and they end up going with another individual, James Blaine. And essentially what you have over the next couple elections is the Democrats and the Republicans attempting to control the standards of economic growth. So in 1884, you have the Republicans pitting James Blaine against the Democratic candidate, Grover Cleveland. It's a very dirty election. It comes out that Blaine was offering political favors for the railroad company stock, essentially. It comes out that Cleveland had fathered an illegitimate child when he was younger, so there's lots of that going on in the election. But ultimately, Cleveland manages to pull out a win. It was a problem, possibly for him. There was some worry that he might lose his home state of New York as a result of his trying to get rid of the political machines while he was governor there. But some fortunate coincidences managed to get him that vote in that state, and so he was able to pull out a win in the election. Cleveland was very laissez-faire, so very hands-off as far as the government and the economy went. But there was one place where he was very passionate, and that was about the tariff. At the time that Cleveland takes office, the tariff is extremely high, and it's bringing in a lot of money into the sort of federal coffers, and they've actually got a surplus. Well, Cleveland thought that the surplus was dangerous because it would tempt legislators to distribute the money in the form of pensions or public works programs in their home districts, commonly referred to as pork barrel projects. And so he felt that by lowering the tariff and taking away that surplus, it would remove the temptation to do that. He also was very against any idea of sort of public welfare, and so against the idea of veterans' pensions, which ultimately ends up hurting him in the next election because Union veterans are a huge voting bloc for the Republicans, and it didn't do Cleveland any favors to alienate them in that way. So in 1888, you have Cleveland pitted against a new candidate, which is Benjamin Harrison. Harrison argues for a high tariff to ensure business prosperity, decent wages for workers, and a healthy home market for farmers, as well as advocating for those veterans' pensions, and so manages to scrape by with the win in the Electoral College in his election. In the election of 1888, Cleveland does actually manage to garner about 100,000 more votes than Harrison, but Harrison managed to win states that were key as far as the electoral votes. And so he comes into office. And basically, what we now have is a threat to the surplus because Harrison's going to roll in and he's going to roll out a lot of those projects that Cleveland was hoping to avoid, but the biggest one being a pension system. The pension rolls expand drastically from just over 600,000 people receiving them to nearly 1 million people receiving pensions, and it's basically our first large-scale public welfare program. To go along with this, Republicans also passed the McKinley tariff, which raises the tariff rates to an all-time high. That way they can continue funding these pensions. Basically, you have an instance where government becomes more and more out of touch with society as we move along and get closer to the turn of the century. So, as a response against this very corporately minded government that we have, you start to see farmers' movements develop. And the first of these was the Grange movement, or the Patrons of Husbandry. This was founded by Midwestern farmers in 1867, and it offered things like information. They had libraries, like the picture would imply. They offered emotional support, fellowship, they had cooperative shops, they offered discounts on machinery, and all these things in order to help farmers sort of become more self-sufficient. The Grange movement became very popular throughout the Midwest and began lobbying legislatures for laws that would protect them. And the main businesses they sort of focused their ire on was the railroad business. And so you have laws passed in states that try to regulate railroads and their sort of out-of-hand competitive practices. And eventually these laws come before the Supreme Court, and they are challenged by these companies. And the two cases mentioned in the slide here, Munn versus Illinois and Wabash versus Illinois, are two of the big ones, and important because they actually sided with the farmers over the business interests, and it upheld this idea of controlling business interests. Out of these as well, we actually see federal action come into play. You have the passage of the Interstate Commerce Act, which reaffirms the federal government's power to oversee railroad activities and established a new agency to help it do just that, the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Grange movement starts to falter, though, and is ultimately replaced by the Farmers Alliance movement. The first Farmers Alliance was founded in Texas in 1870, and it very quickly spread, so throughout the Midwest, in the South, and all of these areas. And so they start trying to make this into a formal political movement. They began by endorsing candidates, and as they gained success in that, they began trying to form an actual political party. You also have forming at the same time a Black Farmers Alliance movement. And there was an attempt to try and bring those two groups together to create a biracial group, but you have problems with racism, especially in the Southern Farmers Alliances, which are in line with the separate but equal principle that was passed down from Plessy. The attempt to form a political party ultimately results in the creation of a third party to challenge the normal two-party system, and this was the People's Party of the United States, or more commonly, the Populist Party. The Populist Party did put a candidate forward in the 1892 election, and this was James Weaver. They advocated for various things like a sub-treasury plan. They tried to court the labor movement, so they threw an 8-hour work day and things like that in there. And while the party was unsuccessful, they only garnered about 8.5% of the total vote. So Weaver wasn't elected president, obviously. But they did manage to elect senators. They elected 5 senators, 10 congressmen, and 3 governors. And so it seems as though the party might actually be successful. The problem was that the strength was spotty. There wasn't solid regional support for the party, which made it very unlikely that they would be able to win anything in the Electoral College. Eventually, the Populist Party gets sort of folded into the Democratic Party. So populism as a ideology remains popular, but the Populist Party just sort of fades into the Democratic fold eventually. So now we'll turn our attention to what is happening with African Americans in the South after Reconstruction. So with Reconstruction, during that period, you have Reconstruction governments that are usually pro-civil rights, or at least civil liberties for African Americans in the South. But with the Compromise of 1877 that saw President Hayes elected, you have those forces pulling out of the South, and you have a reestablishment of white supremacy in the region. One of the means by which they achieved this was to disenfranchise black voters. And they used various methods for doing this. None of them could be direct because the vote was protected by the Constitution at this point, and so they used indirect means like poll taxes or literacy tests or property requirements to disenfranchise these voters, and then created loopholes so that white voters who wouldn't have met these qualifications would be able to still practice their vote. Disenfranchisement was only one part of this. You also see segregation becoming much more prevalent in the South as well. After this, after Reconstruction, you see state after state imposing segregation principles in their constitutions, or writing them into their constitutions. And this negatively overall affects the African American population. But there were some who were able to make an opportunity out of this because you needed separate facilities now for both races. Those who wanted to open up restaurants strictly for African Americans, or barbershops, or shops in general, like general stores, could do that and make actually an economic profit off of it. But for the most part, it was yet another way of just imposing supremacy, white supremacy, on the black population in the South. And this got a federal endorsement with the passage, or with the ruling, in the case Plessy versus Ferguson. In Plessy versus Ferguson, the justices upheld a Louisiana law that required segregated railroad cars. Racial segregation, it was argued, was constitutional if equal facilities were made available to each race, but quite often the caveat requiring equal facilities was ignored, and they were able to get away with that quite easily. By far the most effective means of subjugating this population was lynching. It became the ultimate enforcer of white supremacy. In the 1880s and 90s, you see about 100 black individuals lynched annually. And it happened mainly in the South, although the North wasn't completely devoid of this kind of action. It was usually based off of unsubstantiated accusations or rumors, so it wasn't necessarily any form of justice. The people that were victims of this had committed, for the most part, no real crime or anything that would have justified this kind of action. It was really just a way to impose supremacy and to subjugate a population. And it tended to fluctuate. It went up as political protests went up. So when you have the alliance movement and you start to try and join the two alliances together, you actually see an increase in lynching because they're attempting to assert political influence, and the white population didn't appreciate that. Very few Northerners actually protested the South's white supremacist society, and so it was described by one Frederick Douglass that the North will remain equally involved with the South in this common crime. It's essentially tacit compliance. You do have response from certain black leaders as well in the United States, with the most prominent being Booker T. Washington. And he's preaching an idea of compliance for the most part. He urges the black population to acquire useful skills such as farming and carpentry. And once they've managed to prove their economic value, then racism would begin to fade. And this is an okay message in the late 19th century, but people begin to get fed up with this message very quickly. And you see a lot more militant activism as we move into the turn of the century and the early 20th century as well.